future masterclasses. So welcome to our October masterclass. And today's focus is, it's a strategic coaching focus. I was just telling Natalie, we really have sort of three main areas of topics for our masterclasses. When we are on a strategic coaching topic, we're usually talking about something related to coaching and how to either increase your coaching skills or maybe enhance the services that you're offering as a coach. We also, in last month, we had a masterclass around a specific feature in Coachmetrix. So we call that a Coachmetrix deep dive. And last month's masterclass, we looked at a new feature we rolled out this summer called anchoring of the pulse feedback scales. So we dove into that feature last month. In November and December, we're going to be focused on some business development topics. And so we'll talk more about how do we grow our coaching business to get ready for 2022. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to talk about the future of work and share some observations that we're all noticing about the future of work, the return to work, and some of the challenges that our clients are facing in this environment that we find ourselves in today. We'll spend some time talking about how do leaders need to think differently with the unpredictable environment that they find themselves in. We'll talk about some strategies to support leaders, strategies to support teams in the hybrid environment. And then I'll leave you with a few Coachmetrix tips that get into the system a little bit on how to measure behavioral change as it relates to the future of work. So that's where we're headed in our conversation today. Couple of reminders, feel free to go and register. We've got our next masterclass on November 19th, masterclass on December 17th. So we're going to get into like strategic planning or some planning type topics related to your coaching practice in each of those masterclasses to give you an opportunity to start thinking about 2022. For those of you who are new to Coachmetrix, what we want you to know is that Coachmetrix is built by coaches and made for coaches. Hello. So we created, hello, welcome. And Robin, maybe you could just keep everyone on mute. And by the way, folks, feel free to come off of mute at any point in time. This really is intended to be interactive, but stay on mute in between so that we can minimize background noise. So we built Coachmetrix because we had a need in our coaching and leadership development practice. And part of what we first learned is that when people's action plans were paper-based, they either didn't do them or they didn't do them to the extent that drove behavioral change. So that's one of the main features of the platform itself. We also started to notice about 5 or 6 years ago that people showed up less and less with pens, meaning they had this digital mentality. And so we needed a platform to get resources and tools and frameworks and content online. And maybe most importantly, we wanted to add more accountability around behavioral change measurement, something that most coaches don't do, or they do it in a really clunky way that involves spreadsheets and survey monkeys and other types of things. And so that's where the idea and the seed for Coachmetrix came from. And what we want to always tell you is that we love your feedback. Help us improve the platform, help us adapt it for the future of coaching and the future of work. We can't always promise that we'll build features that you want, but we will promise that we'll listen. So thank you for any input that you have on how to make Coachmetrix better. So let's jump into our topic for today, which is about the future of work. And I know this has been just a wildly, popular topic on every social media platform, in the news, with just about any article or magazine or newspaper that you pick up. But we're going to talk about it here as it relates to coaching. And to kick off the conversation, I'd love to hear from you. I just set up a couple more things. Sorry, I forgot I had these slides in here. So I remember when COVID became real for me. It was March 9th, 2020. I'm sure everyone here has their own stories around this, but I was supposed to fly to Florida with some clients, some technology clients from Minneapolis. And we got a call the day before, March 8th, from the CEO, and he said, we're not going. And that's when it was like, oh, wow, this thing is real. But it'll be over in 30 days. And, we'll probably have a slow month on the coaching side, but we'll be back into it. Well, little did we know that all of a sudden social distancing was going to become part of our vocabulary, like the exact opposite of our most important need, human need of connection, right? All of a sudden, we've got to keep distance from people, and we found ourselves working virtually or remotely with kids at home and not in school, or taking care of elderly people, or all of these other domains that started really impacting our coaching practices. And on top of that, we were working with clients that were going through variations in their businesses. Some clients were rapidly scaling up, others were downsizing, and they've been through 2 or 3 iterations of that since then. We've been through a lot, and now we're going through maybe the second or third phase. I heard a client say the other day, COVID 4.0. And as you notice our clients either starting to return to work or having some variation of the future of work, what are you noticing? We're going to share 12 trends with you, but love to hear from you first. What are some trends or observations that you have that's happening in the workplace today as it pertains to either the future of work or return to work? Take a moment to type something in your chat box right now. What are some observations or trends that you're picking up on as it relates to the future of work? Put something in the chat box, and we'll talk about some of those observations that you've got. What are you noticing out there? Mark, are you seeing anything? So Laura, you're noticing anxiety. Maybe that's just a good place to start. We're certainly seeing the same thing. Mark, most prevalent people want to work from home. Interesting, now and in the future. Mary Beth, people, especially women, don't want to return full-time to offices. They want flexible options. Yeah, that word flexibility certainly is one of the big things that we're hearing across clients, across geographies, across demographics too. Finding employees don't want to commute to work. We've all had this opportunity to find some extra time in our schedule. Leading is harder these days. Mary Beth, tell us a little bit about that comment. What are you noticing with people that you're leading or coaching or engaging with?
Sure. I should say also I do a lot of consulting and sort of how do we want or helping clients think about how to enable their leaders to be better leaders. And that's the trend right now, is towards more human leadership, more care and connection. I mean, this happened during COVID as well, but certainly there's been a push towards balancing execution with care and connection. Yeah. And if you look at HBR, you can see all the articles coming out on that as well. So that's pretty much the trend, which then follows with the need to provide flexible options. How do we do that? CEOs are still worried about how do we make sure we achieve results while people are working flexibly and still not fully recovered from the anxiety of the last couple of years. And people are saying, guess what? This needs to come, our health and wellness needs to come first. So just a lot of leaders are struggling with how to find that balancing act at the C-suite level. And then and then the couple of levels down are struggling with how to manage teams with that going on amongst the team.
Yeah, really great, really nice summary of several trends that are happening. Thanks for that, Mary Beth. Laura, what's coming up in your world? What are you noticing? And you're on mute. Thanks. I'll do that 5 times today. So we're good.
Very similar to what Mary Beth was saying. I'm actually going to be speaking on a panel about return to work next Friday, and it's really about that balance, and it's really the polarity of we need to do both. We have to be empathetic, and we also need to drive results. And so many of my clients are experiencing the great resignation, and we don't want to alienate people, and if we don't give them options, will they leave? So I'm actually thinking it's such an interesting time right now, because I think people are forgetting what a relationship is. It's two-way. And if you're always getting your way, if the leader is always getting what they want from their team, that means they're not being empathetic, they're not being flexible, and vice versa. As the employee, if it is always on your terms, you're being a dictator. So
right.
I think that it's easy to do. It's easy to do like the sound bites. We have to be more empathetic. We absolutely do. But I also think there also has to be personal accountability of what does it mean to be in a work relationship. So I think it's that challenge, and how do you message that without sounding like a hard ass? So I'm taking the perspective of my clients right now. I'm not taking the perspective of my peers and my friends who work for these leaders.
Yeah. I love that. And I haven't quite heard it framed in that way. It's a great point. Like, we're so focused on how organizations can be flexible and adapt to what employees need, but it's a two-way relationship. And maybe the scale is out of balance right now. And that's what happens when it's a strong labor market. But
and that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about on this panel next Friday. Because
so
when you say it out loud, it's like it absolutely makes sense, but people aren't really talking about it that way.
Yeah. And Mary Beth, your comment in the chat box, the relationship is under generational issues also. I can make some assumptions about that, but would love to hear what you're seeing or what you know.
Well, I'll just relay an anecdote. There was I think it was New York Times, it might have been Wall Street Journal article that was talking about, I think Laura probably read it this week, talking about how, even millennial bosses are out of touch with sort of the latest generations that's moved into the workplace. And they're perfectly comfortable saying, I'm done with my work. It's 3 p.m. Why can't I log off for the day?
Right.
And it's just an entirely different mindset that is putting pressure towards like uber flexibility, even beyond what I think most of us even consider appropriate of the older generation
And that was a cringing article. That was a very cringing article.
Yes. Yeah. And leaders, a lot of C-suite leaders are our generation. So how do we help them remain open to that perspective? Yeah.
Great. I'm dating myself because it's kind of funny to hear you say that millennials are kind of cringing at the younger generation that's coming into the workforce, because for so long it seemed like that millennial generation was the one that felt so out of touch with how the older generation would work, or vice versa. So now we're even seeing that younger generation come in that has a whole different philosophy, or maybe some differences in philosophy than millennial. Yeah. Mark, what are you noticing? You mentioned people want to work from home, or now and in the future. What are you seeing with your clients?
I think it's a really interesting dynamic where people sort of quietly just want to stay home and do their work for all kinds of reasons. I think someone was talking about commuting, for childcare, for just general well-being, to be on the Peloton, to do whatever it is, to have ultimate flexibility. And it's interesting that even at the highest levels of the organization, in individual one-to-one conversations, sort of saying that if I had my choice, I'd rather just sort of stay home, if as long as I get my work done. Yeah. They'll give a nod to the team dynamics and kind of missing it from time to time. But when push comes to shove, I've heard more about people wanting to stay at home, whatever that looks like. And it's not even a hybrid stay at home. It's like just be at home completely. And I'm just hearing more and more of it. I think it's really interesting because we're getting a little bit more of a demand for people to return to the office full time. Organizations are paying big dollars for commercial real estate, and they want to sort of take advantage of it. So they want them back into that space and, tout the benefits of working as a team. And I do a lot of teamwork, and I think it's really beneficial. Does it dilute when you're working at a distance? A little bit. But I think it's really going to be the pressure from the youngest generation. Yeah, moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. So some overlaps, some common themes there, and a few new things. Interesting that you're seeing. I'm hearing more from you that it's when push comes to shove, people would prefer the remote option. I'm hearing a lot of hybrid preferences that people have, but some of this might be geographical, some of it could be type of industry. So it's just interesting to hear these different perspectives. We've got a few trends that we're noticing as well. I'll share with you. You've touched on many of these already. The first one, I first heard this framed by Allison Meadows, who's the Chief People Officer at Evolve Vacation Rental, fast-growing sort of Airbnb type company in Denver, Colorado. And what she said is that over the past 18 months, we've experienced our lives in a different way, and maybe in ways that were not available to us previously, helping our kids at school, or in the middle of the day spending time with family in some way, or maybe getting that Peloton workout, as you mentioned, Mark. And that temporary perspective change has resulted for many people in a priority change. And people are realizing that in many ways life is short. They aren't going to tolerate a bad boss or a toxic culture. And the workplace has to allow them to bring their whole self to work. So in many ways, it sort of touches on some of the things that you mentioned, but the idea that, oh, my perspective changed and now my priorities have changed too. I'm not sure I'll say much more about flexibility. We hear this in almost every conversation and podcast that where we've interviewed senior executives. Just there's a demand from employees to want more flexibility. And then the challenge becomes when you have site required people and people that can easily work remotely. How do you not create a divide between and sort of two elements of your workforce? We have found that the people connections do matter. And while we've been incredibly efficient in the workplace, we are finding that there is a strong need for more people connection. And the challenge that I think we're starting to see bubble up now is, how do we build that people connection in an environment that for many organizations is likely to be hybrid? But when we've got this remote workforce, we miss many of the artifacts and the posters on the wall and bumping into people. And we have to think intentionally about how do we build the same level of connection on a Zoom call or video call of some sort. A few other trends, the ping pong tables won't cut it. And, the beer tap, the beer on tap and the snacks and the ping pong tables, fun, nice, but they're really surface level benefits for companies. And we see this more often in many of our fast growing tech related companies. But I think what's shifted now is that employees want their employers to genuinely care about who they are and to understand that their life is multifaceted. They want their employers to allow them to bring their whole selves to work. Charlie the cat, who you met in the background of my Zoom call, Charlie needs a vet visit. And now there's a deeper connection. Or my kids have this need, or my elderly parent or someone I'm taking care of has another need. There's a whole nother level of understanding. And some of you mentioned this earlier, Mary Beth, this idea that we have to be able to get results, or maybe Laura, you said this, results and relationships, or results and empathy. It all matters. And we have to think about doing both as leaders. The way you treat employees matters. We did an interview with Mary Hassett, who's the Chief Human Resource Officer at Lamb Research, 14,000 person organization. And what they found in their own research compared to the tsunami of attrition was that they treated their employees, they always treat their employees really well, but they did some extra things during the heat of COVID that has resulted in a very strong level of loyalty. So as we're seeing this tsunami of attrition happen, what we're also finding is that organizations that have treated their employees well are seeing different results in terms of attrition and retention. Number 6, hybrid meetings are rough. We were leading a strategic planning session this last week. We had one leader in India who, for whatever reason, couldn't get to Colorado, and 15 leaders in person. It's just really hard. It's easy when everyone's remote. It's easy when everyone's together. but really getting this hybrid environment down is going to be a skill set that everyone's going to have to master. A few other things, Mark, you mentioned space and people returning to the office place. For those organizations that are returning in more of a hybrid scenario, we're starting to notice that they're thinking about how to use space differently. And they're thinking about when people come into the office so that space is used more for meetings and collaboration, and home office is used more for autonomous work and working independently. But the whole concept of how we use office space is starting to shift, at least with some of what we've seen in organizations. Boundaries need to be redefined, hands down. We're also noticing that people are tired, they're stressed, they're anxious as well. And part of the reason is we've got these meetings that are stacked up all day long, and there are fewer boundaries between when people start work and end work. And there's new agreements that need to be set. Culture building takes intention. It's harder to build culture when you don't see people every day. And across leaders, when we speak with them, this is the top three things that keeps them up at night. How do we build culture? How do we maintain culture when we're not seeing people? We've hired people who we've never met. We have leaders who are leading people that they've never met in person. There's so many new dynamics that impact culture. Number 10, mandates are coming to a head, whether it's mask mandate, vaccination mandates. We're starting to bump up again against organizations that will be requiring thousands of people to be vaccinated. And they're facing all sorts of pressure from employees. And I think they're getting to a point where they've offered incentives and they've tried to do this in a collaborative way. But I think we're getting to a point where many organizations, I think many of our clients, are going to require people to be vaccinated because they need to for employee safety, they need to for business continuity reasons. And we're getting to a point where it's really going to come to a head. We're seeing this in New York City. If you've been in sort of following the news around the state employees requiring to be vaccinated, et cetera. So I think this is going to be an interesting dynamic that leaders haven't faced in the past that we're going to have to help them coach through. Employees are asking the question, is it worth it? I think that's a really key question. And part of what's contributing to the tsunami of attrition. Do I have to work with this toxic environment or with this manager who doesn't treat me with respect, or fill in the blank, especially with such a tight labor market where there are so many options and so many opportunities outside. And finally, people are tired. Some of the Census Bureau data that we've been tracking, the percentage of people that are feeling down, depressed, or helpless, 42% of people report that they're feeling down, depressed, or helpless at least several days a week, 21% more than half of the time. And the percentage of people that feel nervous, anxious, or on edge, that was one of the first comments in the chat box, 52%, at least several days a week, 30% more than half of the time. So the whole concept, the whole idea around mental health and people's well-being starts to become much more important for us as we're coaching and helping our leaders. I guess my question for you now is, given some of the trends we've shared, some of the trends that you've identified, how do leaders have to think differently in this environment? Like if thinking is so critical and is part of what we do as leaders often spend time thinking about what they do. They often don't spend time thinking about their own thinking. From your vantage point, how do leaders need to think differently with the future of work or in the future? Feel free to put something in the chat, or if you've got a thought on that, come off mute and love to hear your perspective. Thanks, Laura, by the way. Great New York Times article that Laura referred to is in the chat box. It's really helpful. Mark says flexibility. Mary Beth, they need to carve out time for higher level thinking more than ever. Yeah. And also, Laura, I'm sorry, Mary Beth, for that, at a time where there's more, at least what I'm experiencing or seeing with our clients, there's more going on than we've ever seen before. Like the days are stacked up. How do you get that white space or that thinking time, that higher level thinking? What's been your experience with that, Mary Beth? What are you noticing here?
There was an interesting study article that said that, most of us haven't ever cleared the stress cycle from the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And, neurologically, biologically, if we don't clear a stress cycle, like if we don't finish it and recharge, reset, that we can't function effectively. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of our clients, that the always on, the lack of boundaries, the responding to emails now, even later. There's a great Microsoft chart that shows the huge increase in the amount of chat and email and everything that hit, March 2020, and it hasn't gone down. And so I see that with a lot of leaders, that the quality of thinking feels more challenging given the inundation of their days.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's we often think about change, and I'm sure everyone is here has seen some variation of a change curve, whether it's a variation of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on grief and loss, but we never really go through just one change. There's multiple change that may be happening, and to think about it in that way, that we're not almost getting closure on that. It's sort of stacking up and building. It's a really interesting way to put it. Thanks, Mary Beth. Any other thoughts on how leaders need to think differently in the future or in the future of work? What we think about is the idea, I'm sure many of you have seen variations of this, but the idea of predictability versus unpredictability, and the way that leaders think in a predictable environment is different than in an unpredictable environment. So in a predictable environment, there's some kind of playbook, or the cause and effect is known, or you can know it in advance. And so you can seek out an expert or some playbook, or maybe you have knowledge because of past experience. And so you can see a situation that's happening, you analyze the situation that's happening, and then you make a decision and move forward. And oftentimes we've got procedures and policies and checklists that tell us what to do. But in an unpredictable world, we don't know. The cause and effect isn't known in advance, meaning there isn't necessarily a solution. I'm not sure I've ever met anyone that's come back to work after a pandemic. I certainly haven't. And so there isn't necessarily a playbook, but it's not really just about the pandemic. I think it's just about the increasing pace and complexity that is our world, where we don't necessarily have the answers up front or don't know where to go to for the answers. The thinking process has to be different. And it starts with experimentation and moves to learning from the experimentation and then pivoting and shifting. I think Amazon is a great example of an organization that really embraces this type of thinking. The idea of having experiments, learning from them, and developing mechanisms is just really well done in that organization. But I think part of what we can help leaders do and realize is that the way in which they have to think is different in this environment versus in a more predictable environment. All right, so how do we help? Given all these trends and maybe even a shift in thinking, what are some ways as coaches, consultants, facilitators that we can help our leaders? What are some things that we can do to help them respond in this unpredictable environment?
I think for me, pre-pandemic, my business was probably like 1/3 exec coaching, 1/3 leadership development, 1/3 offsites and retreats. And since the pandemic, it's been 90%, coaching. People have just put the money there.
Yeah.
And what I really feel like what we offer our clients, even pre-pandemic, is what it's all about. It's creating a safe space where they can be vulnerable, where they can get that macro view that they can't always get when they're firefighting and back-to-back Zooms. And I think that that coaching space is even more precious than ever before. And you just making sure that they have their own rituals of how they transition to our meeting and from our meeting. You know, I just feel like the gift of coaching right now has never been more appreciated by my clients. That is just, would really love to hear what other people are experiencing.
Yeah, love that perspective. Thanks, Laura. What are you noticing with regards to what Laura just shared? Mary Beth.
I'll jump in. Maybe it's the nature of the organizations I work in, but they're struggling so much with balance and resilience that it's actually harder for some of the clients I have to orient themselves to coaching goals. I have a large cohort of leaders in a financial services firm, and they're all just really struggling with the workload, the disconnect, etc. And coaching feels like a luxury to them, but also something they just can't seem to quite. They wish they had more time and motivation to really tackle it. So,
and is it feeling, Mary Beth, like it's just one more thing?
Yep.
On top of so many layered things that they're wrestling with.
Yes, and I'll say that's a high potential leadership development program. So it's additional. It's coaching to enhance performance. Some of the leaders I have that have to fix issues, the stakes are a little higher. Well, they have more motivation there, but for the people where coaching is, an enhancement to their good performance already, it feels like another task item right now, more than it ever has.
So interesting. There's even a distinction here between what you're noticing in more of a cohort-based leadership development program versus maybe a one-on-one safe space that Laura's referring to. Cool. It's good to hear that perspective. We're seeing a mix because we run, for folks that don't know me, Coachmetrix came out of a coaching and leadership development firm that we have separately. And so we still run that firm, and we do both cohort-based leadership development as well as one-on-one executive coaching. So interesting. I guess I hadn't thought about that distinction between what we're noticing in the cohorts as well as individually. I do think in the cohorts that are more leadership development focused, we're probably seeing some of that as well, Mary Beth. In the cohorts that are more team focused, maybe there's a little bit less resilience because the team is working through dynamics collectively. And then in our one-on-one, I think we are seeing that appreciation for that safe space. And even if there isn't perceived value that I see happening in the coaching session, I'm amazed when coaches say, I just needed to talk that through, and how much value they get from having that opportunity or that space. And Mary Beth, this comment in the chat box, uncertainty triggers fight, flight in the brain, narrowing people's thinking. That's a great point. So one thing is to ensure they're doing things that support resilience and balance. Yeah, it's awesome. Couple of items we'd share in this note. We created a model that I think speaks to some of the earlier points around the needs that people have that are just more human. And part of what we have noticed in the world today is that COVID, I think, has given us a window, almost an opening to make our workplace more human. And this model, we'll be releasing a book on this model in January timeframe, just around needs that people have at work. And it's things like connection and a strong sense of feeling like you belong, and frankly, that you're loved, and certainty, which is really about safety, both physical safety and psychological safety. They're both critically important. Physical safety used to be, in the realm of manufacturing and biotech and oil and gas or whatever, firms like that. But now physical safety actually applies to every organization. And psychological safety certainly is really key in order to create that safe space. How do we ensure people feel like their contributions are valued? How do we create clarity of both the what and the how? And those are what we call the core human needs. Everyone has these needs. And then the two higher level needs, the needs of fulfillment, if you will, when people find places where they can be challenged and grow, and when they feel like they're having a bigger impact on their community or the society and the world as a whole, that's when we really can help drive engagement, fulfillment at work. And so this is a model that we think is helpful for leaders to balance both results, but also relationships and the needs that people have beyond the needs of driving a business result, and really supporting people in bringing their whole self to work. One final question before we wrap up here in the next 5 minutes is around teams. And we're noticing this hybrid environment becoming more and more prevalent as people go back to work. We were just talking to a client the other day. They've got about 600 employees, but they're noticing now that they've got about 100 employees in the office on any given day, which is more than it has been in the last 18 months. What are your ideas on, like, how do we help teams navigate the complexity that comes with the hybrid environment? Is there anything that you've noticed that you'd be willing to share with the group? Laura, you're on mute.
I turned on the video, but not the mute.
No, no worries.
I'm not holding out. This is one of the main reasons why I wanted to come today, because this is something that, my clients we're struggling with. And I'm sorry, the banging is happening again.
Totally
so
fine.
I will turn that off. But yeah, I would really love to hear what people are experimenting with.
Yeah, it's great. The first thing that we're experimenting with that I would offer, and many of you probably discovered this as well. When you've got 5 people in a conference room and you've got 5 people that are not in the conference room, audio is horrible and video is horrible. And so the compromise that we've seen that works actually quite well is with everyone in the conference room that they also have their laptop in front of them and they're on the same Zoom or Teams call, so that the people who are remote can still get the facial expressions and some sense of connection, as opposed to seeing just a bunch of people in a conference room from a distance. And then depending on the audio situation, like literally people might need to wear headsets in the conference room. So it's very logistical, but it has a massive impact on hybrid meetings that just make them much better than when we try to do the conference room with one video that captures everybody. What else are you all learning with the hybrid environment, the hybrid world?
I'll jump in. So I'm noticing that and I have a number of clients where they'll have people in a room, other people at home at a distance. The more structured sort of the engagement, the better. I think, and that's even structured around personal sharing of information. So I've sort of moved to having folks share personal information from the very beginning of the encounter, which seems to work out really well. It's surprising. 5 minutes go around, tell me a little bit about what's going on for you, during the course of the pandemic, or now that we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, good thing going on at work, something good going on at home. And people will comment and they'll say, like, the best part of the meeting was actually just sort of talking about what's been going on. So just sort of creating that space, but having it in sort of a structured sort of format seems to work with a lot of the hybrid teams. So, when to participate, when to sort of put your hat into the ring, and just sort of tightening up some of the engagement of a team seems to be helpful. I think people like that because they know how to jump into it, particularly if they're at a distance, just like this, right? Like you're using the chat box in order to sort of get us moving, and it provides that structure.
Right.
So I think that's a really good, technique, because I know when you ask a question, you're probably going to ask for the chat box. So I'm already going to that space. So
Yeah.
it's quite good.
Yeah, I love that. And there's intentionality about that, Mark, that brings in the connection piece with the efficiency of being remote. And I think those are some really key opportunities that we have to look for. We've seen that with some of our clients. 5%. What's the top 5% of what's happening in your life? What's the bottom 5%? We've seen leadership teams do this on a weekly basis, and it is powerful, just as a way to get people talking and connecting, maybe, outside of the project management task list that happen in so many meetings. I'll share a couple of ideas that we've been experimenting with. Number one, we think teams need to just completely redefine their agreements. And there were, in so many ways, there were maybe spoken or unspoken agreements before COVID. And then there was a radical shift as people went into crisis mode at the beginning of COVID. And for many teams, they're still doing the same things that they were doing during the emergency or crisis mode in COVID. So I just think all team agreements need to be blown up and rethought to really think through everything from boundaries to how do we work in this hybrid environment, what actually works for our culture, how do we bring in things like what Mark just mentioned. So there's an element here of agreements that need to be set. I think people need to connect now and need to find ways to connect now in person. And this can happen even if it's in small groups or sub teams or one-on-ones between managers and leaders. I think managers with their direct reports need to have one-on-ones and do a complete reset. What do you need from me? What do I need from you? Expectations that we have from each other, checking in on a personal level. But some of the connections, where possible, we have to make attempts to get people in person. And then we keep waiting for this new normal to appear. And I don't really know why people are waiting. This is the normal. This is the way things are. The supply chain is not just going to get fixed in 90 days. Like, there's so many things that are happening in our world that we haven't seen in the past, but this is the way it is. And so I think we have to also prepare our teams that this is not a short-term event, but maybe this is just the way life is. Those are the three things. I open it up here. We're a minute over, but open it up for any other final comments before we wrap up. I guess I'll make one quick final comment, which is just bringing it back to Coachmetrix. I think there's an opportunity for some measurement today. Number one, it's going to help you set your business apart, helps keep our coachees accountable. It also can help extend our engagements because we can always measure beyond the end of a coaching engagement. But three quick ideas on measuring, like as we're thinking about new behaviors that leaders have to implement, why not get those behaviors in Coachmetrix? And you can measure behaviors that are specific to each of the coaches that you might be coaching one at a time. Or maybe there's a new set of behaviors that you need all of your leaders to measure. What if they all had the same coaching goals and you're measuring the same exact set of behaviors across all of your coaches? Wow, now you're starting to measure culture change. And then finally, when you're working with teams, why not measure collective team behaviors to see if everyone on that leadership team is creating that open environment of communication or communicating in a way that generates alignment, and measure the collective behaviors of the team. So I think there's an opportunity for some measurements that Coachmetrix can help with. And also remember to integrate that feedback that people get through the pulse feedback back into their action plan, so that they're not updating the goal or the behavior, but they're updating the body, maybe the action items that they're going to focus on over the next 30 or 60 days. And finally, there's an opportunity to leverage that resources feature. If there's a tool or a framework, that New York Times article that you mentioned, Mary Beth, plug that into a resource so people can, get to that content, and that you can use that content across your projects. Resources are a super easy way to add value between your coaching sessions, to supplement what you've talked about, and to create that library that you can use across your project. So I'm going to stay on for a few minutes, but we're over in terms of time. But I want to thank you all for joining us, and hope you'll join us for future masterclasses as well. Thanks, everybody.
Great to be with everyone.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mary Beth. Thank you, Laura. Thanks,
Thanks.
Natalie.
Hey, Sal, I'm going to stay on for a sec. As long
Absolutely.
as construction will permit.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me. We're again.